Hello. I don't promise to be short, but I will try. As Stepan mentioned already, the title of my speech is The Discourse of Inequality and the problem of overcoming poverty in Armenia. In this presentation, in this intervention, I will speak about how the discourse itself influences and drives politics at the level of policies, and how the changes in the discourse can become fundamental for changing vectors of politics and situational changes. These are the questions I have in mind. With these questions I initiated my research and carried it out last year. It's qualitative research, and it was carried out in 3 large cities and 4 small towns. The large cities were Yerevan and Gyumri and Vanadzor, and Gyumri and Vanadzor were chosen as the poorest or the poorer cities, or the larger cities of the poorer regions, and the smaller cities were Spitak in the Lori region, Artik and Armavir. Overall, I conducted 50 individual in-depth interviews and 15 expert interviews. By the way, the in-depth interviews were done with not only the poor people, but those who consider themselves not poor and those who consider themselves to have above average income, and several very affluent people. Oh, I can't give you their names because I promised to them that I would maintain confidentiality, but they're quite affluent, quite rich people, few of whom I also interviewed, as to why we needed these multi-layered interviews. Well, I was interested in how the discourse, well, first of all, what are the groups in society that are involved in this discourse, and what are the links between the lowest groups, which are socially in the most difficult situation? What is the difference between the narrative of the poor about poverty and, on the other hand, how poverty is narrated by the rich and those in power? To me, that was one of the key objectives of the research. Now, the other thing is that the expert interviews were also carried out with a very wide range of respondents, and I conducted interviews using what they now call leftist experts, left-wing experts, who are not really experts in poverty and social matters. They're generally experts who are leftist intellectuals or operating in Armenia. There's also even some extreme liberals that were covered. Some extreme liberals and intellectuals were also covered. Intellectuals is what we will call them. And now, in order to understand what we're looking at, here are a few brief words on the picture of poverty we're seeing in Armenia. Basic statistics are quite concerning. As we all know the statistics already, 29.8%, so close to 30% of the people are generally poor. Of those, about 8% are very poor, and over 2% are extremely poor, undernourished people who don't eat, basically, not enough. There's important subtlety here, and I will give you some numbers on it for subsequent discussion. The official figures showing how are they collected, how are they measured. The upper line of poverty, measuring as simple poor, is 41,000 drams per capita. So that money is certainly, well, if you're above that, you're considered not poor. Clearly, the threshold, that line, is very artificial, superficial, and relative. The very poor are those who get less than 34,000 drams a month. What is it? $70, I believe. The malnourished are 21,000 drams per capita, and that's just unthinkably small of an amount that these policymakers of ours came up with. Without any more data, this is all that I have, and here are a few key problems which are coming up in this research, and then future research. These problems come up, and here are the main three problems. Firstly, poverty from 2008 to 2018. In these 10 years, poverty in Armenia has not gone down. In fact, it has gone up. So it's being reproduced on social and state levels. Referring back to the numbers, 27.4% was level of poverty in 2008, 29.8% in 2018. That's poverty maintaining or rising. But to me, the most important question was that poverty was being reproduced in not only the state and social levels, but also the family level. Many families among this 30% pass poverty on to the next generation. In a conversation yesterday, one of our interpreters told us something interesting. That there's a fact that in education, when the quality of education was assessed, it turns out that one of the most important drivers of the quality of education and achievement is poverty. A child that grows in a poor family, no matter how much they reform the education system, their poverty hinders with the improvement of the quality of education. It's affecting very negatively the quality of education. The other main problem is that our state policy on overcoming poverty is really aimed not at reducing poverty, it's aimed at reducing the indicators of poverty, reducing the percentage, as best illustrated by the fact that in 2017, nobody spoke about the poverty indicators, and our government were sleeping despite the number. And then one of the journalists suddenly asked and found out that there's 32% poverty in Armenia. And there was fierce criticism in the press, and then a year later, the 32% somehow becomes 29.8%. The government focused simply on bringing down the figure, that number, to show that poverty is declining. How do they do it? Simple. The social allowances policy. 97% of the social benefits are the family allowances. And that social allowance, the family allowance, is 18,000 drams. I hope you don't faint. 18,000 drams, okay, is what people get to get by, hoping that these poor people will somehow mitigate their poverty with 18,000 drams a month, plus 5 to 6,000 per capita. On average, it's about 30,000 drams per household, per family. Now this is key. If a poor family gets any help from this, it's bare survival. It's the bare minimum of survival and nothing like human development. The children are denied education. Not quality education, but any education. When I was looking at the recent data with UNDP's global report, Armenia data is terrible. We're afraid to speak of it. In elementary school, 9.8% of the children dropped out because of poverty. Another important problem that was addressed by this research is that the state policy has been based on the notion of inequality, the narrative of inequality. So the very thing I said, the policy of social benefits does not treat the poor as equal to the others, because poor people also have equal education needs and health needs, but that's not the underlying assumption here. If I show you the measure of health poverty and life expectancy inequality, the situation is horrendous. It's 10.1%, which means that if life expectancy in Armenia is 74 years, in the poorer groups, life expectancy is about 8 to 9 years shorter. That's a huge gap if you measure it in years of life. Moving on from the general problems to the reasons for this policy. One of the main problems in this policy is that our state policy, our government policy, serves, all of the government policy serves the rich, the interests of the rich. It does not serve at all the interests of the poor. Why is this important? After the change of government, I'm very curious about whether our government will turn this approach around, whether they stop serving only the interests of the rich and pay some attention also to the interests of other groups. It's important whether the underlying policies will change a key narrative of the discourse, whether the equality narrative can become the fundamental narrative for social policy. Turning now to the narrative. How is poverty narrated was my original question. This is quite interesting. The way poverty is narrated is the way in which policies are implemented. And there's a very key question here. The way poverty is narrated among the poor groups, where is that narrative generated? Are they the authors of that narrative, or is that narrative imposed by a policy of creating a false conscience in the poor groups? False conscience here means, as the common Marxist term that I'm trying to use in this intervention, roughly and very generically to mean that when a person thinks that they are thinking on their own behalf, It turns out they're thinking not on their own behalf and speaking on their behalf, they're speaking on somebody else's behalf because that speech doesn't belong to them. That narrative doesn't belong to them. It's a narrative that is imposed on them from above, by those who are above, by those who rule over this person's life. Turning now to the narrative. What are the main narratives that I was able to find in the course of my research? Here I will enumerate them and then briefly analyze them given the time I have. One of the most interesting findings was that among the poor, the common discourse is that being poor is a shame. It's a disgrace to be poor. Now, when I say being poor is a disgrace, there's something else parallel to it. That it's pride, it's desirable, and it's laudable to be rich. Parallel to this, in the poor, there's the common talk, there's the common narrative that, well then, any method of becoming rich is good. It's the being a person who manages to get rich, being a person who's apt, who's capable, and the poor even justify the methods that are unlawful, illegal, are okay, and it's okay to use these illegal methods and make the poor poorer and continue to keep them in poverty. Do you understand now what an interesting situation this is? Being poor is a shame, and that's the narrative, and it feeds into something else where the poor justify the conduct of the rich who continue to keep them in poverty, and that's the level of the narrative. It normalizes the impoverishment policy and the policy of keeping the poor impoverished. There's another interesting and exciting narrative that I find. When I asked people, or where my co-researchers were asking the interviewees, and we looked at the research materials at the tabulation stage, it was many people who were poor. When you asked them, how would you assess your social situation? They say, fine. So they cannot benefit from quality education to their children. They do not have access to healthcare services, because if they have to get a decent health service, they end up spending huge amounts of money. The family situation changes. They're poor, but they think it's normal because, and I'm going to refer to a case that we all know, months ago, National Assembly Standing Committee for Social Affairs. Okay, this is Standing Committee for Social Affairs. President of that committee, Hako Pakopian, was speaking about inflation. You know what he said? He said, well, the poor person isn't used to buying expensive products, so the price increase will not affect the poor. So that's the discourse of the authorities. Now, on that same topic, Khosrow Harutyunyan, another member of the parliament from the ruling party, takes the floor and says, well, the poor only eat potatoes anyway, and the potato prices aren't what's going up. What's going up are the prices of other products that they don't use anyway. So when you look at this normalizing approach, how poverty is normalized and how the poor consider that it's normal that they be poor and how they characterize it. It's interesting. Well, I'm the average. I'm not the poor. I'm the average. The key feature of this is that it breaks the resistance to the and it deprives them of the ability to demand the ruling elite to change their plight, to change their situation. Because if I'm normal, if I'm the average, even though I'm poor, I don't fight to change that plight. The other narrative is that the poor are poor because of their own brain. That's a very common narrative. It's their own mind, and several ministers have said this to me. Millionaire ministers. I don't know if they will remain millionaires under the new government, or as Marvel said, that they may be taxed under, what did you call it? What was the name of that? The compensation tax, you said, right? They may lose their millions, but anyway, they say, well, it's their own fault, their own minds. It's not because we're bad governors, we're a bad government. So blaming the poor for their poverty has political consequences. It means the government is not guilty of keeping the poor impoverished. It's not today's government policy that is to blame. It's the poor people's own fault. Their own mind is to blame. I wash my hands, let them get smarter. Once they get smarter, they'll pull themselves out of that situation. Discourse, narrative, which I want to discuss and conclude, is that inequality is considered natural. This inequality discourse not only exists, but is in our society considered quite natural. And it has to do with not only the poor and the rich, it has to do with all inequalities. Man, woman, weak, strong, a child, grown up, these inequalities. We're a society of inequalities indeed. Inequality is more common as the meta discourse than the inequality discourse. And in poverty it means, well, it's natural that the poor people will be ignored. It's natural that poor people aren't called to the wedding of the rich relative. And many other naturalizing, normalizing micro-narratives that mean that overall it's considered natural that state policy is based on, and in fact social policy is based on the discourse of inequality, and it's considered natural. So if I say social benefits are to grow and become 200,000 drums, my own friends who are working in the social ministry will tell me I'm crazy. 200,000 drams benefit to the poor, why don't they work? And I'm saying that should be the benefit because they're equal to us. Because their children also need good education. They also have problems. They get sick too. They need treatment when they get sick. That's what shapes this, is what Armen Grigorian is laughing exactly because of this. He said 200,000 is what you should give them. They're equal people. They also have needs equal to ours. Live as equals with us. That's not the underlying idea of state policy. And that's the reason, and let me conclude now and say that's the reason, and I end with a rhetoric question. Is our government, is our governance going to continue realizing inequality, reproducing the realization of inequality in policies? And to me, one of the key problems is whether the new government and the new whether the new authorities will change these discourses which shape policies. They shape social reality and they shape policies. In conclusion, something very important. It's important that the government changes its approach to this discourse and that society and the poor view this differently. But the poor, as my own observations have shown and our data has shown, they're not able to change the discourse on their own. They cannot change the discourse that is imposed from above. So who helps them? Who is to help them to change this discourse? Some experts have said that the average intellectual layer should be helping them and should be assuming the function of changing the discourse. So when I discussed this with my colleagues, German and Austrian, they laughed at me. They said, well, that's impossible. The middle class curses the poor class because they live at their expense in their countries. But I think in our country, they haven't cursed the poor yet, and there's a chance that the middle class can change the official discourse, and perhaps it will lead to something. Sorry for being long, and thank you.